Welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today we're doing a deep dive into some source material that covers, really, one of the earliest and most consequential periods of human history in Scripture, the Noahic era.
That's right. We're looking at Genesis, specifically chapters 4 through 11.
And our goal for today is, to take these detailed theological notes on everything from Cain and Abel through the flood, all the way to the Tower of Babel, and just pull out the critical points.
We'll be focusing on how God's governance over humanity started the really startling spiral of human sinfulness, and how God began to lay out his specific plan for redemption right after that great judgment.
Yeah, we want you, the listener, to walk away with a really clear picture of how sin developed after the fall, how fast it corrupted all of society, and, well, how God secured his own kingdom rule through the Noahic Covenant.
It really sets the stage for the rest of salvation history.
It does.
And what's so captivating here is that this period, even though it's all about the near total collapse of civilization, it's also about God continually revealing himself. We see his righteous demands, this holy reaction to rebellion, and then the very deliberate beginning of this narrowing path of blessing through just one specific family line.
So this study isn't just history. It's giving us the framework for understanding the whole structure of the Bible that follows.
That's it.
All right, let's get into it. Let's start with that initial split in the human race, a separation that, according to these sources, really sets the terms for spiritual conflict for millennia to come.
When you look at the overall character of the Noahic period, the one word that comes to mind is degradation, deterioration.
Right.
The source material is clear that while you see natural human development, culture, technology, civilization, it's happening right alongside a theological revelation that's heavily focused on judgment.
So progress on one hand, judgment on the other.
Yes. The notes suggest that God, during this brief but vital window of early history, was content with bestowing a minimum of grace, just what was necessary to preserve that one mediatorial line.
And that reality, where grace is minimal and sin is just accelerating, it shows up in the human family almost immediately.
It does.
The key feature of this whole degradation is that definitive separation into two branches of humanity. The godly line, which comes through Seth, and the ungodly line, started by Cain.
And understanding that division is the starting point for everything that leads up to the flood.
So the first downward step, the first real trend of sin, begins with the first death in human history. Cain murdering Abel, Genesis 4.
And it's not an accident, is it? This is a willful act of malice.
No, not at all. And we have to really zero in on Cain's motivation because it's not a personality clash. It's about worship. The sources stress that Cain's anger flared up because God acknowledged Abel's offering. And the writer of Hebrews tells us it was because Abel brought his sacrifice by faith.
There it is. Abel's offering was marked by reliance, by obedience. It likely involved a blood sacrifice, which pointed toward God's own provision.
And Cain's offering, well, it was from the fruit of the cursed ground, something he produced through his own toil. And it was rejected.
Which right there sets up two opposing worldviews.
Yeah.
The path of faith versus the path of human self-reliance.
Yeah.
And when Cain saw his brother accepted and himself rejected, that internal pride, that sin, it just erupted. But the Lord gives him this crucial warning, even before the act.
He does. It's an arresting warning. The Lord tells Cain that sin is crouching at the door.
The imagery there is so vivid.
It is. The scholars drawing from the original text see sin as this wild, predatory beast, just lurking patiently at the threshold of the human heart, waiting for a chance to devour the soul.
It suggests sin isn't just a state of being. It's an active, external, and highly dangerous force that's seeking entry and control.
Right. And this picture is used on purpose, isn't it? It foreshadows later biblical warnings, even in the New Testament, with the adversary prowling around like a roaring lion.
Cain was given a direct verbal command to master this desire. He was told he could, and that he should rule over this sin. But he chose not to.
He chose the path of non-resistance. And despite that clear, personal, divine warning, the sources confirm Cain went ahead with a cold, premeditated act. He killed his brother Abel.
And that led right away to his banishment by the Lord, which fundamentally changed his relationship to the earth and to God.
The consequence, then, was a clear extension of the original curse on Adam.
Yes, the ground itself, which had received Abel's innocent blood, would now resist Cain even more fiercely. He was banished not just from his family, but from the settled life. He was forced to be a restless wanderer.
So he would only get produce from the earth through agonizing toil and extreme hardship. It reinforces the punishment.
Exactly. His attempt to overcome the curse through his own works, that unacceptable offering, it just resulted in the curse getting deeper and more personal for him.
So with Cain's banishment, we see the rise of a whole new civilization, the Cainite civilization, the ungodly line.
Mm-hmm. And the defining trait of this new culture was seeking to lessen the painful effects of the curse, but doing it completely apart from any reliance on God.
And we need to pay attention to how quickly the civilization developed, and at the same time, how quickly it morally degraded.
They happen in parallel. City life, which is this structural attempt to find human safety and permanence outside of God's direct care, it shows up almost right away.
And advice just accelerates right alongside that urbanization. You see it perfectly in Lamech, who is the fifth descendant from Cain.
Right. Lamech introduces polygamy. He takes 2 wives.
Which is a direct attack on the creation mandate of one man, one woman. He's seeking self-gratification and maybe more worldly security through a larger household.
But here's where the source material points out something genuinely challenging. The Cainite civilization was incredibly innovative.
Yeah, that's a crucial point. They weren't just morally bankrupt, they were cultural pioneers.
The arts develop. We see the invention of musical instruments. Metallurgy advances rapidly. They're creating tools, weapons, methods for processing metal.
And this highlights a timeless point for us today, doesn't it? That civilization, technology, and culture can reach incredible heights at the very same time as radical moral decay and spiritual rebellion.
Absolutely. Their ability to solve practical problems, how to build a city, how to use copper and iron, it didn't translate into any willingness to obey God. In fact, their technological skill often just enabled greater vice.
The violence is also very stark. It reaches a terrifying peak in Lamech's statement in Genesis 4, sometimes called his sword song.
He's bragging. He brags about killing a man for wounding him and a boy for striking him.
Which suggests a prideful escalation of personal revenge way beyond the 7-fold protection God had promised Cain.
Lamech has adopted this mindset of extreme, disproportionate retribution and self-defense, completely unmoored from any sense of justice.
So, okay, we have this culture that is technologically advanced, culturally expressive, and just morally corrupt. Now let's look at the parallel story in Genesis 5.
The line of Seth.
Yes, which traces the descent of the Sethite line. This is the godly strain, the remnant that was seeking the Lord. And the contrast between these two lines is theologically just arresting.
It clearly shows 2 fundamentally different responses to the consequences of the fall. And you can compare the 5th descendants as a perfect little picture of this conflict.
Lamech, 5th from Cain, was the first polygamist. Seeking physical security, self-gratification, he's a picture of man relying on his own strength.
Right. Conversely, Enoch, the 5th descendant from Seth, was the first one recorded in this line to actively walk with God.
Which implies a conscious, intimate, daily relationship of obedience and fellowship.
Unlike Lamech, who was chasing earthly security and vice, Enoch's life was defined by his dedication to the Creator, and it culminates in his translation. He was taken by God without even experiencing death.
And critically, the source material points out that the Sethite line was the one that began to worship God properly. Genesis 4.26 says, men began to call upon the name of the Lord.
That is the distinguishing mark. That act of calling upon the name of the Lord separated the Sethites as the vessel through which God's redemptive purpose, the preservation of the true faith, would be secured.
Even while the Cainites were busy building their secular kingdom. But here's the crucial tension. We see this clear split. One line focused on God, marked by worship and faith, the Sethites, and the other focused on man, marked by technology and violence, the Cainites.
Yes.
How long did the source material suggest the separation held? And what happens when those lines merge? Because that merger leads directly to the flood.
And that's the entire narrative arc of the degradation. It sets the stage for the next section, where the integrity of the godly line fails, which leads to global corruption.
So that first era ends with 2 separate cultures, but the time leading up to the flood describes the tragic, catastrophic merging of these cultures.
And the universal corruption of the human race that resulted from it.
Right. Genesis 6 details this accelerating deterioration. Even with the Sethite line established as the godly line, the one with true worship, the line failed to maintain its spiritual separation.
And that takes us immediately to the discussion of the sons of God and the daughters of man in Genesis 6.
A famous passage, sparks a lot of debate. Our source material, acknowledging the controversy, suggests that the context points most strongly to the intermarriage of the godly Sethites, the sons of God, and the ungodly Cainites, the daughters of men.
And that interpretation just makes the most sense within the structure of Genesis. It's a spiritual collapse, not just a physical one.
Right.
When the faithful line marries into the line of secular rebellion, that spiritual distinction is just erased. The righteous remnant failed to stay separate.
And the result of this widespread mixing was, well, it was catastrophic theological contamination. The human race sank to the level of flesh.
And that term flesh, or basar, it isn't just about physical weakness. The source describes this condition as humanity abandoning itself completely to sin, becoming totally dominated by sinful stock and desire.
Their entire existence became focused on earthly, temporal, non-spiritual pursuits. It's basically confirming the depravity that Adam's sin introduced into the human condition.
And the scope of this rebellion was terrifyingly comprehensive. The sinfulness of man was intense, it was profoundly rooted, and it covered the entire inhabited earth.
The material stresses this period marks man's overt collective rebellion against God's constituted authority and kingdom rule on a massive global scale. God looked down and saw only wickedness.
And here we find a critical idea. God declared that his spirit would no longer strive with man.
A shocking decree.
It is. It suggests a time limit on common grace, a definite end to God's ongoing effort to restrain sin and call humanity to repentance. It's a divine withdrawal confirming the world was past the point of return.
So into this universal spiritual darkness, Noah stands out completely alone. He's the single exception.
His survival and his qualification are central to understanding the continuity of God's mediatorial kingdom rule.
Noah was that isolated, faithful individual. He maintained a relationship with God when everyone around him had sunk into the flesh.
He served as the mediator of God's kingdom rule, standing out as a righteous man in a world defined by absolute corruption and violence.
And the text defines Noah's standing with two complementary Hebrew terms, which gives us a precise picture of what covenant obedience looked like before the formal law.
Yeah, the sources really require us to slow down and consider the depth of these words.
Absolutely. He was, first, righteous. The Hebrew word is zedek,
which is viewed manward. It means he was upright, just, and fair in his dealings with other people. He fulfilled his social obligations. He didn't participate in the violence and exploitation that filled the earth.
So in a world of corruption where you just took what you wanted, Noah was equitable.
Right. And second, he was blameless. The Hebrew word is tamim,
which is viewed Godward.
It suggests integrity, completeness, or soundness in his relationship with God. It means he was wholehearted in his faith and obedience. This is much more than just upright. It implies a state of being fully dedicated to God's ways.
And that combination is key. He wasn't just a good neighbor, Zedek. He was wholly consecrated to the Lord Tamim.
And the clear contrast is that while the earth was filled with violence and corruption, all these attempts to live without any reference to God, Noah walked with God.
His life wasn't only personally devout, it was publicly distinct. I mean, he built that enormous ark over what tradition suggests was a century, acting as a preacher of righteousness and a visible sign of obedience when the world just ridiculed him.
Right.
But I have to bring up a point of tension here, as the source material itself suggests. If Noah was truly tamim, blameless, with such profound integrity, why did his own actions right after the flood, the incident with the wine, and his nakedness lead to such a massive curse on his own grandson, Canaan? Does the material address that seeming contradiction?
That is a necessary question, and it highlights a major theological point. Noah's righteousness in Genesis 6 is spoken of relative to his generation.
Okay.
It's a description of his character that qualified him to receive God's favor, the grace he found, and to be the mediator of the kingdom. However, his sin after the flood proves that even the most righteous of men remains tainted by the Adamic curse.
So even after the world is cleansed, the problem of sin is still right there inside the ark's inhabitants.
Exactly. The sources affirm that no human being is absolutely sinless. Noah's integrity was measured by his covenant, obedience, and faith, not by perfection.
And that distinction, righteousness by faith but still bearing the stain of sin, it sets up the necessity of judgment.
Sin demands a holy response, and the Lord announces righteous judgment upon humanity.
This is where we see God's holiness in action. He announced the total destruction of the world because the corruption was universal and complete. God had waited, he had striven with man for 120 years, but now the window of grace was closed. Judgment was set.
And here we find a template that really guides the entire scripture. The source points out the consistent, inseparable theological idea of judgment and blessing seen side by side in Genesis 6.
This is the crucial framework.
It is. God's action is always twofold. While he promised to judge sinful humanity with the flood, he simultaneously announced his blessing upon Noah, the man who found grace.
So this divine tension ensures that even in the most severe act of holiness, God preserves the mediatorial line.
Yes. The vehicle through which redemption would eventually arrive would continue through the Noahic line, even as the wicked world was destroyed. God's grace operates within the context of his justice, not in spite of it.
So once the waters had done their work and that tension between judgment and grace was resolved, the very first thing that defined the new earth was the establishment of a formal, explicit relationship between God and the surviving human remnant.
Immediately after they disembarked from the ark, the first action recorded of Noah is the most critical. He built an altar and worshiped the Lord.
And that action defines the start of the new post-flood world.
It does. This act of worship is highly significant because it's the first account in the Old Testament of worshiping the Lord using a blood sacrifice on an altar, specifically burnt offerings.
The sources note that these sacrifices would later be intimately related to the system of dedicatory offerings and atonement in the Levitical Code. So this establishes a clear pattern. Post-judgment reconciliation depends on a sacrificial system.
And God smells the soothing aroma, which confirms his acceptance of Noah and his sacrifice.
The covenant itself was announced earlier in the Ark instructions, but it was formally established with Noah and his descendants after the flood.
And this covenant is paramount because it establishes the foundational principles by which man is to rule over God's kingdom on the restored earth. It regulates society itself.
And unlike many future covenants, a key characteristic here is that this covenant is unconditional.
Yes, the source material states clearly that no conditions are attached to man's performance. God said it was something he would do. The phrasing is definitive. I establish my covenant with you.
This unconditional guarantee is essential because it secures the continuation of life and the stability of the natural order on Earth, regardless of humanity's inevitable future failures.
It means seasons and harvests will continue, ensuring the environment stays stable enough for the redemptive plan to progress. Without this guarantee, every sin might risk a new global judgment.
And this unconditional covenant then provides 5 vital provisions for regulating life and maintaining order in the post-flood world. And these provisions fundamentally restructure humanity's relationship with the earth and with each other.
The first one is Provision 1, transmission of the human race. The first command is a repeat of the Adamic mandate. Be fruitful, increase in number, and fill the earth.
Which was existentially necessary since the population had been reduced to just 8 people.
It was.
But we have to start on the critical omission compared to the original mandate in Genesis 1. The earlier command was to subdue the earth. That command is conspicuously absent here with Noah.
The sources suggest that this forfeiture of the subdue command is profound. It implies humanity's authority to dominate and master creation has been altered or limited due to sin's effects.
So man is still commanded to fill the earth, but the effort to subdue it, to bring the natural world completely under human governance, that's now an open-ended struggle.
It's permanently marked by the curse and the resistance of the earth itself. Humanity will always struggle to maintain complete mastery over the natural world.
That is a massive theological shift. It speaks directly to why humanity constantly faces natural disasters, environmental challenges, the persistent difficulty of getting resources.
It reflects the ongoing tension introduced by the fall, now solidified in this covenant structure.
Okay, moving to Provision 2, fear of man in animals.
Right. Previously in the garden, animals were voluntarily subjected to man in harmony. The sources suggest a major change in the human-animal dynamic happens now.
And this change is required by the very next provision. Because man is now granted permission to become carnivorous, God placed a distinct protective fear of man into the animals.
And it wasn't for man's benefit alone. It was instituted for the animal's own protection and preservation. It's a divine mechanism to maintain the stability and balance of creation against human predation.
Which brings us to Provision 3, sustaining human life. This is the key dietary shift. Man no longer has to be vegetarian. Meat is explicitly permitted for food.
This completely changes the dynamic relationship with creation and the food chain.
However, this permission comes with a strict, life-affirming rule. Blood was not to be eaten. Why? Because it represents life. Why such an immediate restriction?
The restriction serves as a constant physical reminder that life belongs to God. Even when consuming an animal's life, man has to respect the source of that life.
So by draining the blood, dedicating it back to the ground. They're acknowledging that life is sacred and belongs to the giver of life.
Yes. It connects the act of eating to a recognition of divine sovereignty over all existence.
Now we get to provision 4, protecting human life. This is the most significant provision in terms of governance and law.
Noah, as the covenant administrator, was given the ultimate responsibility to guard the sanctity of human life.
This provision establishes the principle of civil law applied globally to all of humanity. God placed absolute, non-negotiable value on human life, and it stems directly from the truth that man is made in God's image.
And the sources really stress this link. Murder isn't just a crime against another person. It's seen as a direct, defiant assault on God's own person and his delegated representation on earth. It's an attack on the Imago Dei.
And the requirement for justice is absolute and immediate. Whoever kills another man forfeits his own life.
This mandate serves as the biblical theological basis for capital punishment. It's consistently referenced throughout Scripture, the civil laws of the Mosaic Covenant, and is even alluded to in the New Testament when Paul speaks of the governing authority bearing the sword.
But the crucial Reformed theological point here is who administers this justice. The covenant dictates that vengeance was not to be taken personally by a family member, a blood avenger. It was to be administered strictly through constituted governmental authority.
This is the critical institutional point. It establishes the first global post-fall civil decree, showing the structured nature of God's kingdom rule on earth through human instruments.
So God delegates the authority of the sword, the right to administer justice and protect life, to civil government.
And that authority is a gift of common grace, instituted right after the Great Judgment to maintain stability and prevent a rapid return to the violent chaos of the pre-flood world.
It's not just a law, it's the birth certificate of human government, placed under a divine mandate. This provides the structure necessary for any future redemptive history to unfold without collapsing into anarchy.
And finally, provision 5. Promise against future universal flood. God promised never again to send a flood that would destroy all humanity. The rainbow serves as the sign of this covenant.
So that guarantee of stability, secured by a visible sign, allows all the other covenant provisions, law, food, multiplication, to operate without the constant threat of total annihilation.
It assures humanity that the natural order is secure until God's redemptive plan is fulfilled. Noah, in mediating this unconditional covenant, sets the structural parameters for all future human society, law, and life.
Which moves us perfectly into the final segment of this era, where we see the path to redemption dramatically narrowed, and where we witness humanity's first organized kingdom rebellion against these very covenant provisions.
Despite the recent terrifying judgment and the establishment of the Noahic Covenant, God announced he would bless the human race again, but this time the blessing would be focused.
Yes, the future blessing is announced specifically through the line of Shem. And this act signals a further crucial narrowing of the mediatorial line. We go from Adam to Seth to Noah, and now specifically to Shem.
The sources connect the statement, "Blessed be the Lord," to the descendants of Shem. And this is highly significant because it suggests the true faith, the knowledge and worship of the sovereign God, would be preserved primarily among them.
Thus identifying them as the line in fellowship with God.
And the terminology Noah uses in the blessing is incredibly telling. The English translation Lord, always in all caps in our texts, renders the divine name, YHWH, often pronounced Yahweh.
That sacred name is used when referring to God in his specific covenant relationship with humanity.
The fact that this specific covenant name is used in Shem's blessing confirms that the Messiah, the promised one who will establish the eternal kingdom, would come through this line.
It confirms the direct progression of God's redemptive architecture from the very beginning.
And you can trace that lineage. Shem's descendants include Arpachshad, the ancestor of the Hebrews. Even more specifically, Eber is identified as the source for the name Hebrew, which ultimately identifies Abraham.
The entire trajectory toward Israel, the nation that will receive the full law and the promises, is established right here, post-flood. So what about the other branch, Japheth? Was his line left with no spiritual hope?
Japheth also received a blessing, but the focus shifts. The name Japheth itself means to be wide or expansion, suggesting his descendants would spread out over a wide geographical area, which historically corresponds to the Indo-European peoples.
And when Japheth is blessed, the name Elohim is used. May God enlarge Japheth.
And that name distinction is deliberate. Elohim is the generic Hebrew name for God as the powerful creator and general governor of the world. So this blessing tends to respect earthly, material blessings, expansion, territory, prosperity.
Okay.
While Japheth's line certainly benefits from earthly blessings, the sources are careful to add that his descendants would eventually participate in spiritual blessings by dwelling in the tents of Shem.
Which anticipates the inclusion of the Gentiles into the spiritual blessings carried forward through the Shemite and later the Hebrew line.
Right, so the synthesis is revealed. God will administer his kingdom program through the line of Shem, culminating in the Hebrew people and the Messiah, but the blessing is ultimately for all people and nations.
With the Japhetic line ensuring the wide geographical reach necessary for the gospel to eventually fill the earth.
But before that fulfillment could happen, this narrowing of focus and the establishment of covenant rule immediately provoked the first great kingdom rebellion in the post-flood world, the Tower of Babel.
We move right from the covenant to this spectacular failure in the land of Shinar. The people settle there, they find a plain, and they decide to build a city and a tower whose top will reach into heaven.
And this wasn't just a construction project, it was a religious and geopolitical statement. The structure was likely a ziggurat, an elevated step pyramid platform used for worship, often dedicated to astral or earthly deities.
So it was an attempt to create an alternative, concentrated religious system that didn't rely on the God who just judged the world.
And the source material analyzes the sin of Babel as a complex, four-part rebellion. It represents a direct, willful defiance against the entire framework of the Noahic Covenant.
The first sin was simple rebellion against God's explicit command. The Noahic Covenant commanded them to fill the earth.
They were actively rejecting dispersion. They were congregating in a single, powerful urban center. Their whole project was a declaration that they would stay put.
Second, the project was marked by radical self-glorification.
They sought their own glory instead of the Lord's. You can see it in their planning. Let us build for ourselves, let us make for ourselves. The focus was entirely on human autonomy and human capability.
Completely ignoring the God who saved them in the ark.
Right. Third, they wanted to seek honor by making a name for themselves through the tower. This ambition was driven by pride, a desire for human legacy, a refusal to acknowledge that true honor only comes from a relationship with and obedience to God.
And the fourth sin was maybe the most geopolitical. They wanted to avoid dispersion.
The tower was meant to be a permanent physical rallying point to prevent them from scattering. Their goal was to build their own concentrated human kingdom, intentionally opposed to God's plan for distribution across the globe.
A distribution that was designed to facilitate the eventual spread of the covenant blessing.
If you look closely, their actions were an attempt to reestablish the pre-flood condition. A unified, centralized human kingdom driven by technological ambition and moral autonomy, all defying God's stated will.
They were trying to undo the scattering that the judgment had necessitated.
They were. And God's reaction is described with illuminating terminology that showcases the balance between his supreme, infinite nature and his active engagement with the world.
It's highly instructional. The Lord, who is distant and transcendent, is described as needing to come down to see what they were doing.
This language demonstrates his immanence, his active engagement and governance of the world he created. The structure they built to reach heaven was so insignificant that the transcendent God had to descend just to get a good look at it.
And the source material also suggests that the Trinity is implied in the statement, "Let us go down," which suggests an internal divine counsel in administering this judgment.
It points to the deliberateness and unity of God's action.
And the outcome was swift and specific. God confused their speech. By halting their communication, the construction immediately failed, and the people were scattered across the face of the earth.
Which is the most beautifully ironic conclusion to this entire section.
It is.
Through the means of confusing their language and unity, a negative act of judgment, God accomplished his original positive purpose. The people were scattered and thus fulfilled his command of filling the earth.
Human rebellion does not thwart God's will. It just forces a different yet still certain means of its fulfillment. God's sovereignty reigns supreme over human defiance.
And that act of sovereign dispersal brings the Noahic era to a close, setting the stage for the specific call of Abraham, which begins right after the dispersion.
This whole era, from that first murder to the scattering of the nations, is a theological powerhouse. It reveals several crucial attributes of God that establish the framework for everything that comes next.
First and foremost, God is a righteous God. He demands obedience to his commands. His justice isn't negotiable. You see it in the personal warning to Cain and the global judgment of the flood. Obedience matters.
Second, God judges sin. He does not tolerate widespread, overt rebellion. The flood stands as the ultimate demonstration of his holiness and refusal to overlook moral collapse.
Third, God is both transcendent and immanent. He's supreme, yet he's actively involved. He's the God who commutes with mankind, walking with Enoch and Noah, and yet comes down to inspect the work at Babel. He governs from above and below.
Fourth, God receives the worship of his people, and he dictates the terms of that worship. We see this requirement instituted through the blood sacrifice, first mentioned when Noah builds his altar after the flood.
Fifth, God is absolutely sovereign. His will shall come to pass, regardless of the unified technological efforts of man to thwart it. The scattering at Babel, which enforced his initial command to fill the earth, demonstrates this definitively.
And finally, God will secure his redemptive plan through the chosen line of Shem. The anticipation of the Messiah and the future kingdom rule, the final completion of God's plan, is clearly promised here.
So if we synthesize this entire era, what is the critical takeaway for you, the listener? This period shows that even in the face of the worst possible deterioration, God never relinquishes control.
He maintains cosmic order. He establishes the first comprehensive system of civil law through the Noahic Covenant, specifically the provision for capital punishment. This structured authority is instituted to prevent society from returning to the violence of Genesis 6.
The material shows you that the separation between the Cainite and Sethite lines illustrates the constant reality of the two cities. Rebellion versus obedience. Civilization can develop impressively building cities, advancing metallurgy while intentionally seeking self-glory and mitigating God's curse apart from him.
Right, the development of culture is not equivalent to spiritual righteousness.
Furthermore, that provision of governmental authority in Genesis 9 establishes the first global post-fall civil decree. This shows that the existence of structured, just rule is a deliberate act of God to maintain stability, a necessary mechanism of common grace.
It ensures that society has the necessary order for the line of blessing, through Shem, to be preserved.
The entire era acts as a concentrated picture of God's interaction with the fallen world. He judges sin, but he always preserves a remnant and guarantees the continuation of the world through an unconditional covenant so that redemption can proceed.
We've tracked the dramatic progression from Cain's personal rebellion to Lamech's escalating violence, and finally to a global kingdom-building rebellion at Babel. Reflect on how this judgment and blessing pattern from Genesis 6 sets a non-negotiable template for how God interacts with humanity throughout the rest of Scripture.
And consider this closing thought. The command to subdue the earth was forfeited through sin. However, the command to fill the earth was reissued and then forcefully enforced at Babel. What does the specific absence of the subdue command tell us about humanity's standing relative to creation? It suggests that man's existence will always involve struggling with creation, rather than mastering it easily outside of the full restoration that covenant righteousness provides. That's something for you to consider as you process this deep dive.
Thank you for joining us for Reformed Thinking.